Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a question, really a fundamental one. Its answer pretty much dictates the fate of democratic stability. What is the true operational capacity of the mass public? We often idealize the citizen, this rational, fact-absorbing, independent voter. But the empirical reality, well, when you really hold it up to the light of political science, it's far more complex, dynamic, and honestly, kind of unnerving when you start to see the mechanisms at play.
That's the core tension, isn't it? I mean, if we're going to have a functional democracy, we rely on citizens to delegate power effectively, right? To hold representatives accountable, make these big consequential choices. So our deep dive today, it's really dedicated not to judging the public for its shortcomings, but to understanding the precise cognitive shortcuts, the information inequalities, and the systematic biases that truly determine political judgment.
Exactly. Our mission here is to provide you with a robust framework. The idea is you'll walk away understanding that public capacity isn't some static, fixed measure of intelligence or anything. It's something highly variable, highly unequal, and ultimately it's constructed by our institutions, the flow of information, and maybe most crucially, by personal identity. We're synthesizing some of the heaviest hitting works in political attitude and behavior change.
We certainly are. We're pulling from a really powerful stack of sources today, kind of laying the academic foundation for this whole discussion. We're going to begin with Converse's seminal 2000 essay, Assessing the Capacity of Mass Electorates, which really forces us to grapple with the profound inequality of political knowledge.
Okay, and then sort of seeking a solution to that capacity gap Converse identifies, we turn to the institutional fix.
Right.
That's offered by Arthur Lupia and Matthew McCubbins in their critical book, The Democratic Dilemma. And we're drawing on James N. Druckmann's overview of their work on credible communication, too.
Yeah, but then we have to address the modern threats, right? So we'll examine the systematic failure of rationality posed by misperceptions. For that, we're drawing on the work of Brendan Nyhan, Jason Reifler, and DJ Flynn on the nature and origins of misperceptions. And also that really sobering real-world case study documented by Stephen Kull, Clay Ramsay, and Evan Lewis in Misperceptions, the Media, and the Iraq War.
And finally, we confront this powerful paradox. It really challenges the whole idea that education is some kind of political panacea. We'll use the challenging findings of Mark R. Joslyn and Donald P. Haider-Markel in their work, Who Knows Best? Education, Partisanship, and Contested Facts.
So quite a journey.
It really is, from inequality to institutional design and then diving deep into psychological bias.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this, starting with the stark reality of how political knowledge is actually distributed and maybe why the average voter is kind of a mythical creature.
Right. So when we approach Converse's work, especially his later reflections in 2000, we kind of have to start by clearing up a misconception about his earlier findings. He really rejects that label of being an apostle of voter ignorance. His goal wasn't simply to call voters stupid or uninformed.
No, not at all.
No.
He wanted to reposition the conversation entirely, didn't he?
Exactly.
Move the issue away from just looking at the low average knowledge, the mean, and focus relentlessly on the massive variance. The extreme heterogeneity of information across different people. He even frames his work around that paradoxical aphorism: never overestimate the information of the American electorate, but never underestimate its intelligence. The core issue isn't raw intelligence, it's stored political knowledge.
Precisely. The fact that the mean knowledge level might be low is, frankly, less critical than the staggering difference you see between the highly informed citizen and the least informed citizen. This huge gap, this is what he calls the maldistribution of information. And he provides this compelling, almost chilling logic for why this inequality doesn't just stay the same or shrink, but actually explodes exponentially over time.
And that logic is the positive feedback loop, right? Can you walk us through how that mechanism works? How does it create such a steep inequality in knowledge?
Yeah, it's actually elegantly simple when you break it down. It takes information to get information. So think of your brain's political memory like a library or a filing system. Prior political knowledge supplies you with these mental pegs, cubby holes, and other place markers. So when new information arrives, say a news bulletin about a new bill, if you have that existing structure, you instantly know where to place that information. You know which committee it likely came from, which political figures are involved, what existing context it modifies or fits into.
You've already built the scaffold, essentially.
Exactly. You've got the framework. If you have those mental pegs, the cost of ingesting a new relevant fact is incredibly low. You absorb it quickly, it makes sense, and it reinforces the existing structure you already have. Now contrast that with the citizen who has, well, basically no pegs, no existing political scaffold. When that same news bulletin arrives, it's just noise. It's disconnected data. They lack the contextual reference points to organize it or even attribute meaning to the new data. For them, the information costs are exponentially high, and they often just can't absorb or organize the new facts effectively.
Wow. So information inequality is like a self-perpetuating system then.
Mm.
The people who are informed find it easy, almost effortless, to stay informed and get more informed, while the people who aren't find it geometrically harder just to catch up.
It creates what we might call a high Gini of knowledge. You know, the Gini coefficient, typically used for income inequality, measures inequality where 0.00 is perfect equality and 1.00 is complete monopolization by one person. Converse points out that if you measure the Gini of knowledge using a typical, easy political survey asking basic questions, you might get a modest number, maybe 0.20. And that's because the test is only asking for the low-hanging fruit, facts that almost everyone knows or should know.
Okay, so those easy surveys can kind of lull us into thinking the difference isn't that dramatic.
Exactly. But Converse argues pretty forcefully that if you made the test sufficiently difficult asking about deep contextual political procedures, obscure historical facts, the kind of knowledge only the truly deeply engaged possess, that Gini coefficient would predictably jump. He estimated it would go over 0.60. That represents a profound structural inequality in political capacity.
And to make this difference really concrete, he proposes this stunning thought experiment, comparing the least informed citizen to the highly informed one in terms of just like raw, stored political knowledge.
Yeah, imagine this. You ask a large group of adults to simply list political personages they can recall from long-term memory, and maybe add a brief descriptor just to prove they actually know who that person is. Converse estimates the median citizen, the person right in the middle, might list 20 or 30 names. But then there's a huge chunk of the population. They might struggle to list more than 2 or 3 names, maybe the president, maybe a very prominent local figure, and that's about it.
Okay, 20 or 30 for the median. Now compare that to the highly informed person, say a legislative aide, or maybe a professor specializing in the executive branch.
Right. That highly informed person, even if you restrict the time frame to just a few decades, could easily list several thousand names. Thousands. Across the executive, legislative, judicial branches, party establishments, we are literally talking about 3 orders of magnitude difference in stored knowledge. Think about that gap. It's not just a difference in opinion. It's like they're inhabiting fundamentally different political realities based on the information they hold.
That really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How representative can survey results possibly be if the people answering the questions are operating from such fundamentally different knowledge universes?
And this leads directly to profound methodological implications for researchers. Converse insists that measuring political information isn't just about collecting trivia, like knowing the length of a senator's term. Those specific facts are used as a diagnostic tool. The score you get is diagnostic of the deeper contextual knowledge structure. It reflects the difference between knowing 2 names and knowing 2,000 names. So research, he argues, absolutely must stratify by sophistication level. Otherwise, we're just mixing apples and oranges, and our conclusions about the collective public are potentially meaningless.
He also uses data from that France Mass Elite panel study, the one he did with Roy Pierce, to illustrate this need for stratification. What did that comparison reveal about attitude stability over time?
It showed really clear monotonic differences across the different involvement strata, both in terms of ideological stability, like how consistently people place themselves on a left-right scale, and ideological constraint, how their issue positions hung together. The elites, the hyper-informed political stratum, showed remarkably stable left-right self-placements over time. Their views were consistent. Conversely, the mass public, especially those at the lower political involvement strata, well, they exhibited massive instability, huge fluctuations.
So if you tracked the least informed person over a few years with surveys, it would look like they were wildly flipping their position back and forth between liberal and conservative.
Exactly. The sheer difference in stability between the least informed stratum and the most informed, the elite stratum, was enormous. He calculated it was almost 5 times larger across the ideological spectrum. And this is where he directly addresses a long-running critique of his earlier work, the infamous response instability or non-attitudes finding from the 1960s.
Right, the critique from people like Christopher Aiken or Robert Erickson, who tried to argue that this instability wasn't real, it was just measurement error. They claimed the survey instrument itself was flawed, not that the voter lacked a genuine underlying belief.
And Converse strongly, strongly rejects this. He calls that counter-argument a tiresome canard. This gets a little bit into psychometrics, the science of measurement, but it's really vital to grasp his point. The conventional view often assumes reliability. The consistency of a measurement is just a fixed attribute of the survey question itself. But Converse, drawing on his deep psychometric background, argues that reliability in political inquiry is actually a joint property. It depends on both the instrument and the object being measured, meaning the person responding.
Okay. So the stability of the attitude we measure isn't just fixed by how well the survey question is designed. It's an outcome of the respondent's apperceptive mass, their underlying ability to actually decode and understand the question based on their stored knowledge.
Precisely. If the respondent lacks that apperceptive mass, that stored contextual knowledge structure we talked about, their response to a specific political question is, statistically speaking, almost like flipping a biased coin. It shows near zero correlation from one survey wave to the next. It's not necessarily that the survey question itself is flawed, it's that the political attitude being measured might be genuinely non-existent or just radically unstable because it lacks a firm factual or conceptual foundation in the person's mind.
And didn't some critics try to disprove him by, ironically, filtering their data in ways that actually proved his point? Like by excluding the most and least informed people?
Yes, exactly. They inadvertently proved his point by artificially truncating the variance. They cut off the extremes, the highly informed elites, and the least informed strata, which removed the very heterogeneity he argued was essential to observe the phenomenon accurately. The French data was so powerful because it explicitly included elites and robustly stratified the public by involvement levels. It showed the information effects were absolutely massive. So Converse's final conclusion is pretty stark. Electorate capacity emerges from three key points. One, these large, often exponential information inequalities.
Okay, that's the heterogeneity.
Two, the widespread use of compensating shortcuts or heuristics, which importantly he says are species-wide economies. Everybody uses them, not just the uninformed, though perhaps differently depending on sophistication. And three, aggregation properties. Things like elections, which, at least in theory, can sometimes transform noisy, error-prone individual inputs into sensible collective outputs.
So Converse leaves us with this picture of massive internal inequality. It almost suggests democracy is being run, or at least stabilized, by a tiny, well-informed minority whose consistent views hold the political center together. But this really begs the question, doesn't it? Are we over-indexing on encyclopedic knowledge? Do citizens really need to know everything to make a good decision? And that's precisely where Lupia McCubbins step in, aiming to fundamentally reframe this democratic challenge.
Yeah, that transition from Converse to Lupia and McCubbins is pivotal.
Yeah.
Converse really defines the information gap, the heterogeneity. Lupia and McCubbins, they define the dilemma. The dilemma is that citizens cannot possibly master all the complex details of every policy, from monetary policy details to military appropriations bills. It's just too much. Yet democracy fundamentally requires them to make consequential choices and, crucially, to delegate power to representatives and institutions.
Right. So how do we solve this inherent limitation? The citizens' limited time, limited mental bandwidth, they argue the solution lies in making a really crucial distinction between information and knowledge.
Yes. This is their key intellectual move, I think. Information is just the raw data, the 1,000 pages of a legislative bill, the endless list of historical facts. Knowledge, on the other hand, is the ability to accurately predict the consequence of choices. What citizens really need is knowledge. The ability to choose wisely between options, not necessarily encyclopedic information about every single detail.
Okay, so they effectively recast this low information problem. It's not necessarily a voter failing, but more of a system design problem. If voters can somehow successfully gain knowledge despite having low information, then maybe the dilemma is solved, or at least manageable.
Exactly. The core question then becomes, can communicators, politicians, experts, institutions provide signals that recipients have good reason to believe? They argue citizens don't need to know everything if they can identify trustworthy sources of guidance, and if the institutions around them provide strong sanctions that make deception costly for those sources. This really shifts the burden of proof, doesn't it? From the voter's brain to the design of the political system itself.
And this connects directly to the idea of delegation, which they argue is just the bedrock of how modern democracy functions. Voters delegate to elected officials delegate power to committees, legislators delegate tasks to bureaucrats. It's delegation all the way down. So how do we ensure these chains of delegation are successful?
Right. For delegation to work successfully, And by successfully, they mean the principal, like the voter, can distinguish between better and worse options offered by the agent, like the official, and the agent generally acts in the principal's interest. Two critical conditions need to be met for what they call enlightenment or persuasion. The receiver, the principal, must perceive the speaker, the agent, as having two key qualities. First, having knowledge. The speaker must be perceived as actually knowing the relevant consequences of the action being proposed.
Okay, perceived expertise. What's the second condition?
The second is being trustworthy. And trust, in their model, basically comes from one of two sources.
Let's unpack trustworthiness, because that seems absolutely central. What are the two paths to establishing trust?
Okay, so path one is perceived shared interests. If the receiver believes the speaker has the same fundamental goals, the same values, or maybe belongs to the same community or party, they're more likely to trust what the speaker says. It's an assumption of aligned incentives. Path 2 doesn't rely on shared interests, but rather on external forces that compel the speaker to be honest. And this is really where institutions come into play in a big way.
Okay, so these external forces are essentially the institutional mechanisms that enforce credibility, that make lying too costly. What are some examples?
They include things like formal penalties for lying, such as perjury laws and testimony or significant fines, but also informal penalties like serious reputational loss that could end a political career if you're caught misleading the public. They also include verification by others. If a political opponent or the media or an independent fact-checker can easily check and disprove a claim you make, you have a strong incentive to be honest in the first place. And the third mechanism they mention is the use of costly signals. Things like running expensive advertising campaigns to stake out a position or getting public endorsements from other credible figures. These actions demonstrate a level of commitment to a course of action that makes backtracking costly, signaling sincerity. These institutional factors basically are designed to make deception too expensive, too risky to be a worthwhile strategy most of the time.
So, if I can put this simply, Lupia and McCubbins are kind of saying that as long as the political system has effective tattletale mechanisms, ways for deception to be exposed, and clear punishments for getting caught, then voters don't necessarily need to read the whole 1,000-page bill themselves. They just need to know which trusted source, which credible cue giver they can delegate their attention to.
That's a great way to put it. Precisely. Democratic institutions, things like electoral systems, legislative procedures, rules of evidence in courts, they function as institutions of knowledge, precisely because they provide these sanctions and verification mechanisms, making deception costly and thereby facilitating enlightenment, helping people gain knowledge even with limited information. This is where that famous fire alarm analogy comes into play, which they draw from earlier work on congressional oversight.
Right. Tell us about the fire alarm analogy in this context. How does it illustrate the principle?
Yeah, this comes from earlier work by McCubbins and others, looking specifically at how Congress oversees the bureaucracy. Congress, has limited time and resources. They can't possibly afford to run police patrols, meaning detailed, costly, direct investigations of every single agency's activity all the time. It's just infeasible. So instead, they design a system of fire alarms.
And the fire alarm system relies on third parties, right, like citizens, interest groups, maybe even disgruntled insiders, to monitor the bureaucracy and basically sound the alarm, pull the lever when an agency steps out of line or does something wrong.
Exactly. And that system works theoretically because the institution, Congress, maintains control through the threat of sanctions. Agencies anticipating that someone might pull a fire alarm if they mess up have an incentive to act within the bounds of what legislators want. The core idea that Lupia and McCubbins apply to the broader electorate is that principals can learn what they need to know from the alarm activity, from these signals, when the signals themselves are credible because of the institutional setup.
And didn't Lupia demonstrate this empirically with those complex California insurance reform initiatives back in the day? Voters who didn't know the policy details but used a credible cue.
Yes, that was a landmark study. He showed that voters who were generally uninformed about the specifics of these very complicated ballot propositions, but who knew where the insurance industry stood, which was a very clear, costly, and thus credible signal of the industry's interests, voted in a way that closely mimicked the voting patterns of the citizens who were actually encyclopedically informed about the details.
That finding is really critical, isn't it? It showed that these shortcuts, these heuristics, could work as effective substitutes for detailed information, but only so long as those shortcuts were rooted in credible signals. So Lupia and McCubbins offer a relatively optimistic perspective here. The heterogeneity of knowledge that Converse describes so vividly Maybe it's not a fatal threat to democracy if the system is well designed enough to engineer credible communication and ensure accountability.
That is their core argument, yes. An optimistic, institutionally focused solution.
Okay, but I have to push back here a bit. There seems to be a potential crack in this optimistic foundation. If the two pathways to trust are either perceived shared interests or these institutional sanctions, isn't shared interest often just another way of saying partisan bias? Doesn't this whole elegant institutional solution immediately start to break down when partisanship becomes the strongest, maybe the only, predictor of perceived trustworthiness for any people? If I automatically trust my party's representative simply because they are my representative, regardless of the facts they present or the external checks, doesn't the whole system of credible signaling collapse?
That is a fundamental and, I think, very accurate challenge to the model's applicability in a highly polarized environment. Lupia and McCubbins do acknowledge this implicitly. Their model fundamentally assumes that these cues, whether they come through shared interests or institutional sanctions, ultimately lead to accurate prediction of consequences, that they lead to genuine knowledge. But you're right, you are precisely anticipating the next major academic pivot in this field. Their optimism, which relies heavily on the availability and effectiveness of credible truth-telling signals, runs headlong into the psychological reality of partisan identity and motivated reasoning.
Right, because what happens when the signal itself is intentionally manipulated or distorted? Or, perhaps even more fundamentally, what happens when the receiver prefers the wrong answer? Because believing the wrong answer protects their cherished identity.
And that's exactly where the system potentially breaks down catastrophically. We move beyond the problem of simple ignorance, the capacity problem that Converse highlighted, and into the much more insidious and systematic threat of misperceptions.
Okay, so we're transitioning now really into the complexities of the modern information landscape. Brendan Nyhan, Jason Reifler, and DJ Flynn, in their work, define a misperception not as simple ignorance or just lacking a fact. They define it specifically as a false or unsupported political belief. This seems like a distinct and arguably a much greater danger to democracy than merely lacking information.
It really is. Think about it. A citizen who knows they are ignorant about something, say a complex ballot proposition, will often reach for one of those Lupia and McCubbins cues. They'll look for an expert validator or see what their party leader says. But a citizen who holds a misperception, they often believe themselves to be well-informed about the fact in question. They hold that false belief with high certainty, sometimes passionately. This makes them fundamentally resistant to the very mechanisms of correction and credible signaling we just discussed.
And this resistance, you're saying, is driven by this psychological engine called directionally motivated reasoning. Let's break down that mechanism because it seems absolutely key to understanding why we see such deep polarization on basic facts these days.
It really is key. So directionally motivated reasoning happens when people process information not primarily with the goal of forming an accurate belief, what psychologists call accuracy goals, but rather with the will of reaching a predetermined desired conclusion. These are directional goals. In the political realm, these directional goals get powerfully activated when people feel the need to protect valued identities, primarily their partisanship, but also other deeply held prior commitments or group affiliations.
Can you give us maybe a quick non-political example just to illustrate how a directional goal can override accuracy in everyday life?
Sure, think about a passionate sports fan watching a game. If the referee makes a really close, borderline call against their favorite team, the directional goal, which is something like, my team is great, they wouldn't commit a foul, the ref must be wrong or biased, immediately kicks in. That fan will instantly deploy all their cognitive resources to find evidence supporting the ref's error. They'll remember every bad call the ref ever made. They'll ignore any replay angle that suggests the call was correct. That selective skepticism, that powerful ability to resist facts that challenge your desired conclusion, that's directional motivation in action. Now just apply that same powerful mechanism to fundamental political issues like climate change or economic policy or the justification for a war.
Wow. Okay. And once that directional motivation is deployed, it generates several observable cognitive biases, right? Like confirmation bias.
Right. Confirmation bias, which is seeking out information that reinforces what you already believe. Disconfirmation bias, which is aggressively counter-arguing or finding flaws in information that challenges your beliefs. And selective exposure, which is choosing media sources or social networks that are likely to tell you things you already agree with.
And what's really critical here, and kind of worrying, is that the very cognitive capacity that education provides, the thing Converse noted, distinguishes the informed from the uninformed. that capacity can actually be the tool deployed in service of these directional goals. Highly knowledgeable people might actually be better equipped to rationalize away unwelcome facts. They have more counter-arguments readily available, stored in those mental pegs. They become, in effect, better intuitive lawyers for their pre-existing beliefs.
Exactly. They're better at defending their side, regardless of the objective truth.
And this is precisely why misperceptions pose such a fundamental challenge to the two classic defenses of mass confidence that we just established with Converse and Lupia McCubbins. First, you're saying heuristics fail.
They often fail because the citizen who is misinformed thinks they already have the knowledge. They don't feel ignorant, so they don't reach for an external cue like an expert or a party leader. Instead, they rely confidently on their own internal but false conviction. Moreover, even when people do use cues, like party cues, directional motivation can lead them to twist the information received. For example, if a politician from their own party advocates for a policy that seems counter to the party's stereotype, a highly motivated partisan might just ignore the politician's statement entirely, or assume the media is misreporting it, rather than updating their understanding of the politician or the policy. The cue itself gets filtered through the partisan lens.
Okay, so heuristics can fail or backfire, and second, aggregation fails. This sounds like potentially the death knell for that classic idea of collective rationality, the wisdom of crowds.
It really challenges it fundamentally. Remember, aggregation, the idea that individual errors cancel out in large groups, works only if those individual errors are essentially random. Meaning, roughly half the population makes a mistake leaning one way, the other half makes a mistake leaning the opposite way, and statistically, these errors cancel each other out, leaving the group average surprisingly close to the correct answer. But the work by Nyhan, Reifler, Flynn, and others demonstrates that many politically relevant factual beliefs are not random. They're systematically biased, often in the same direction for large groups of people, because they are rooted in those shared directional goals, like partisanship.
Like, for instance, systematic overestimation of immigrant crime rates among people predisposed to be anti-immigration, or systematic underestimation of the economic benefits of a trade agreement among those ideologically opposed to free trade.
Precisely those kinds of examples. Because the errors are systematic and linked to identity protection, aggregation doesn't cancel the error out, it actually compounds it. The collective decision or opinion becomes systematically irrational because the shared factual baseline, the perceived reality, is itself wrong, violating the core assumption needed for collective wisdom to emerge.
And the ultimate tragic, real-world demonstration of this phenomenon was the widespread pattern of misperceptions surrounding the Iraq War back in 2003. This was meticulously documented by Stephen Kull, Clay Ramsay, and Evan Lewis. Their study really showed systematic factual error shaping national consent for a major foreign policy action.
Yeah, that Kull, Ramsay, and Lewis study from 2003 is a classic and quite sobering. They identified 3 dominant, highly policy-relevant misperceptions that were circulating widely in the U.S. population immediately following the invasion of Iraq. First, there was the widespread belief that weapons of mass destruction, the primary justification for the war, had actually been found in Iraq. Second, there was the pervasive belief that Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was directly linked to the terrorist attacks on September 11th or had substantial operational ties to al-Qaeda. And third, there was the mistaken belief that global public opinion overwhelmingly supported the United States-led invasion.
And what did they find about how common these beliefs were and who held them?
They found these misbeliefs were remarkably prevalent. Often, significant portions, sometimes majorities of the population held at least one of them. And, crucially, these beliefs were very strongly associated with support for the war itself. If you believed one or more of these key falsehoods, you were overwhelmingly more likely to approve of the military action. In essence, the misperceptions acted as a powerful engine driving public consent for the war.
The study also went a layer deeper, didn't it? Analyzing the role of the information environment itself specifically, the media sources people were consuming.
Yes, and this is arguably one of the study's most striking and controversial findings. They demonstrated a direct, statistically significant association between certain news sources people relied on and their likelihood of holding these misperceptions. Specifically, viewers who reported relying heavily on one particular cable news network, Fox News, were significantly more likely to hold at least one of those 3 key misperceptions compared to audiences of other major broadcast and cable networks. Conversely, people who primarily got their news from National Public Radio or the Public Broadcasting Service were found to be the least likely to hold these particular misperceptions.
Wow. That seems like a pretty clear smoking gun, showing how specific elite cues and the broader information environment can generate these systematic, policy-relevant errors in perceived reality, exactly as the theory of motivated reasoning would predict. The media people consumed wasn't just shaping their opinions, it was actively shaping their understanding of basic facts about the war's justification and context.
Absolutely, and that finding leads directly to the next layer of complexity in this whole issue.
Yeah.
The incredible stickiness of these falsehoods once they take root. Once a misperception, whether it's about a foreign war or a domestic healthcare policy or climate science, becomes entrenched in someone's belief system, it becomes incredibly difficult to correct.
Yeah, we've all seen this play out time and again, haven't we? With concepts like the death panels myth surrounding the Affordable Care Act. That claim was decisively debunked almost immediately, yet it continued to shape the debate and generate fear for years afterwards. Why do these falsehoods stick so hard, even in the face of contrary evidence?
Well, there are several reasons, mostly rooted in basic cognitive processes. First, as humans, we kind of instinctively process and accept information we're exposed to as potentially true by default. It actually requires active cognitive effort to critically evaluate it and resist believing it, especially if it feels plausible or fits our worldview. Second, sheer familiarity often acts as a subconscious truth cue. So elites or media outlets can exploit this by simply repeating bogus claims over and over again, making them feel true through repetition. Third, there's the infamous backfire effect, which Nyhan and Reifler documented. In some cases, presenting corrective information can paradoxically strengthen the original false belief, especially among individuals whose identity or ideology is most strongly threatened by the corrections, like their defenses go up even higher.
And even when a correction is, on the surface, intellectually successful, like someone acknowledges the fact is wrong, we still often see effects like belief perseverance or continued influence effects. Right? You debunk the initial smear, maybe about a political candidate, but the negative association or the lingering doubt about that candidate somehow remains, as if the stain never fully washed out.
Exactly. The correction might update the specific factual belief, but the broader attitude or feeling that the false belief generated can linger. This shows the immense frustration facing anyone working in areas like public health communication, strategic communications for the military, or just basic governance. Simply providing more data, more facts, often fails spectacularly. You often cannot beat a strong directional motive fueled by identity with cold, hard facts alone.
So if the path of simple correction, just presenting the facts, is so narrow and often ineffective, is there any path to success? What have researchers found that actually works, even sometimes, to correct a strongly held misperception?
Well, the path is definitely narrow and highly nuanced, but not entirely hopeless. Research suggests that the most effective strategies tend to be those that try to align with the person's directional motive, or at least bypass the direct identity threat, rather than confronting it head-on. First, using ideologically sympathetic sources is often crucial. You need a trusted messenger, someone seen as an in-group validator, to deliver the corrective information. That way, the audience's identity defenses are less likely to be immediately triggered.
So in the context of, say, a military crisis or a public health issue, that might mean having a respected figure from within the skeptical community deliver the corrective message, rather than an official from the other side.
Precisely. The source matters immensely. The other strategy that shows some promise is presenting an alternate causal account instead of just refuting the false claim directly. You need to give the audience a new, coherent story, a different explanation that can fill the gap left by the debunked false narrative. Simply saying, that belief you hold is wrong, leaves an explanatory void. And the motivated mind will often rush to fill that void by just reverting back to the original identity-affirming, even if false, belief because it provided a coherent, albeit wrong, story.
Okay, this whole section really reveals how vulnerable political facts are to our own psychological biases, especially directional motivated reasoning, particularly when those facts get politicized and linked to our identities. And this complexity, this interaction between information psychology and identity, brings us to the ultimate paradox, a situation where the very mechanism we traditionally rely on to improve public capacity education might actually be turned against accuracy itself in some contexts.
Yeah, the work by Mark R. Joslyn and Donald P. Haider-Markel directly challenges a really foundational, almost taken-for-granted assumption of democratic theory. The idea that more education universally makes citizens better, more informed, more rational, more accurate in their beliefs. Now, they agree that education generally improves cognitive capacity, makes a citizen more capable in abstract terms, better at reasoning, understanding complex arguments, maybe processing statistics. But they ask a crucial follow-up question. what is that enhanced cognitive capacity actually being used for in the political realm?
Right. They introduced this concept of the dual nature of education. Education gives you these cognitive tools like a sharper analytical mind, a better ability to marshal arguments. And yes, this can be used to critically evaluate information and resist misinformation. But that exact same cognitive arsenal, those same tools, can also be used much more effectively to mount a robust defense of your pre-existing political commitments and your valued identities.
Exactly. The educated citizen, in this view, can become the ultimate intuitive lawyer. They're better equipped to selectively find evidence that supports their preferred conclusion, and perhaps more importantly, they're better equipped to dismiss, critique, and rationalize away any evidence that challenges their priors.
So their core thesis centers on an interaction effect, doesn't it? It's not just about education, and it's not just about partisanship, but the interaction between the two. They argue that the interaction of education multiplied by partisanship is often the best predictor of factual accuracy, but specifically on contested facts.
Precisely. Contested facts. Those facts that are politically charged and directly relevant to ongoing partisan debates. And the central finding that emerges from their research is, frankly, quite sobering. The most educated partisans are often better equipped to protect their partisan predispositions when faced with inconvenient facts. This means the partisan gap in factual understanding, the disagreement over basic reality, should actually be largest among the most educated, most sophisticated strata of the public, not smallest. Sophistication, in these contexts, amplifies disagreement over reality.
Okay, let's make that concrete. They tested this across several really high-profile, highly salient, contested issues that were central to the policy debate at the time they were writing. Let's look first at the Iraq facts back in 2003, revisiting those same misperceptions about WMDs and the 9/11 link that Kull and colleagues studied.
Right, so the standard expectation would be that education should substantially improve accuracy for everyone, shouldn't it? More educated people should be less likely to hold those misperceptions.
That seems intuitive.
And overall, in the aggregate, yes, education does improve accuracy modestly. But the picture changes dramatically when you split the data by party identification. What Joslyn and Haider-Markel found was that education significantly improved accuracy on those Iraq facts for Democrats and for independents. They became less likely to hold the misperceptions as their education increased. But for Republicans, the group whose partisan identity was aligned with supporting the war and the Bush administration's narrative at the time, the effect of education was near zero. The slope was basically flat.
Wait, let me make sure I understand that. You're saying the most educated Republicans were just as likely to hold the misperception that weapons of mass destruction had actually been found, or that Iraq was linked to September 11th, as the least educated Republicans. Education made almost no difference for them on these specific politically charged facts.
That's what their analysis showed. Education completely failed to override the powerful partisan motivation for that group on those specific factual questions. And the direct consequence was that the partisan gap in factual knowledge concerning the Iraq War was actually greatest at the highest levels of education. The most educated Democrats and the most educated Republicans disagreed the most about these basic facts.
Oh, okay. And this pattern isn't just limited to foreign policy or wartime situations, right? It extends even more dramatically, perhaps, into scientific domains when those scientific facts become politicized. They looked at beliefs about the causes of global warming in 2008 data.
Yes, another highly contested area. What's the traditional expectation there?
Well, presumably that more education should increase the likelihood of someone responding that global warming is primarily human-caused, aligning with the overwhelming scientific consensus. More education equals more scientific literacy, presumably.
Right, and that is exactly what they found for Democrats and for independents. As education levels went up for those groups, so did the probability of them saying climate change is human-caused. But for Republicans in their sample, the exact opposite happened. For Republicans, higher levels of education were associated with a lower likelihood of endorsing the human-caused explanation for global warming.
Okay, hold on. Let me just process that perverse finding again. The more formal education a Republican respondent had acquired, the less likely they were, according to this study, to accept the scientific consensus on the primary cause of climate change.
That is the statistical finding they report. It strongly suggests they were using their heightened cognitive capacity not to converge on the scientific consensus, but to more effectively rationalize and defend the identity-affirming, skeptical position prevalent within their party at that time. And the conclusion from this is just stunning. On the cause of global warming, the least educated partisans actually exhibited the greatest level of agreement with each other, while the most educated partisans were the furthest apart. They were maximally polarized over scientific reality itself.
That is a profound challenge to the common hope that simply increasing science literacy or general education levels will somehow save us from political polarization on scientific issues. It strongly suggests that if a scientific fact threatens my core political identity, I might actually use my intelligence and education to reject the fact rather than update my identity or beliefs.
It certainly points in that direction. And Joslyn and Haider-Markel are careful to demonstrate that this phenomenon of motivated resistance to unwelcome facts isn't just a pathology of one side of the political spectrum. It seems to apply across the board whenever the facts happen to be inconvenient for a particular partisan group's narrative. They also examine beliefs about the effectiveness of the 2007 troop surge in Iraq. Now remember, the context here was that security indicators in Iraq were generally improving following the surge, which tended to align with the Republican administration's narrative that their strategy was working.
Okay, so in that specific case, the available facts on the ground tended to support the Republican position at that moment.
Correct. And consistent with their theory, they found that education significantly increased the belief that the surge was making things better among Republicans and among independents. Higher education led them towards the conclusion supported by the incoming data. Their party's strong anti-war stance, education was not an important predictor of believing the surge was effective. Their partisan identity likely motivated them to resist or discount the evidence of improving security. So, once again, on this factual question, polarization was most pronounced among the most educated partisans.
The overall significance of this finding across different issues is really profound for governance, isn't it? I mean, it implies that when the most politically engaged citizens, the ones who are most likely to vote, donate, volunteer, maybe even run for office, when they cannot agree on basic policy-relevant facts concerning war or climate science or public health, then the shared factual baseline that's arguably necessary for constructive deliberative democracy just completely erodes.
Absolutely. They conclude quite starkly that education alone is simply not a panacea for restoring factual consensus in a polarized age. In fact, on these contested, identity-relevant facts, education can actually arm partisans to resist unwelcome truths. The capacity to skillfully defend a developed political predisposition turns out to be a powerful and perhaps often overlooked driver of polarization, especially on these highly contested facts. They contrast this with what they call tame or non-salient factual knowledge, things like knowing the constitutional procedure for overriding a presidential veto. On those kinds of non-contested facts, education works as expected. Everyone generally becomes more accurate as education increases. It's the contested facts where sophistication backfires.
So political sophistication, the very thing we might hope would be the solution to Converse's original capacity problem, actually emerges as a threat multiplier in our current age of motivated reasoning. It can create a democracy where the cognitive or intellectual elite are, paradoxically, the most deeply divided on the fundamental question of what is real.
It really forces us to acknowledge that cognitive facility, raw brain power, often becomes subservient to the powerful directional motivation of identity protection when politics are involved. High capacity, in these situations, translates not necessarily to shared reality, but potentially to amplified conflict and gridlock. #tag outropopri.
Wow, okay, this has been a necessary and I think pretty deep dive into the true, often uncomfortable, operational limits of public capacity in a democracy. We started with Converse's capacity problem, moved through Lupia McCubbins' institutional fix, then examined the psychological failure modes with misperceptions, and finally confronted that troubling sophistication paradox. So to quickly synthesize these 4 key stages of understanding we've covered.
Okay, summarizing the journey. First, Converse fundamentally showed us that public capacity is defined by extreme knowledge heterogeneity. Remember that 3 orders of magnitude difference in stored political knowledge. This inequality is driven by that positive feedback loop. It takes information to get information, which means practically you absolutely must design your research and perhaps more importantly, your communication strategies for a fundamentally stratified audience. One size does not fit all.
Right. Second, Arthur Lupia and Matthew McCubbins offered the institutional solution. They argued that democratic capacity works best, or maybe only works, when the system itself engineers credible communication and accountability. Citizens can achieve knowledge, that crucial ability to predict consequences, even with limited information, if institutions properly structure the incentives and sanctions for trusted sources, allowing people to rely on credible cues like fire alarm systems, rather than needing encyclopedic knowledge themselves.
Third, the critical work on misperceptions, highlighted by folks like Nyhan, Reifler, and Flynn, and vividly illustrated by that Iraq War case study from Kull, Ramsay, and Lewis, reveals that misperceptions aren't just random errors. They are a systematic threat, often deeply policy relevant and disturbingly sticky. This is primarily because directional motivated reasoning, often triggered and amplified by partisan media environments, frequently overrides the basic human search for accuracy, leading to systematically biased collective outcomes.
And fourth, Joslyn and Haider-Markel delivered that powerful paradox. Sophistication itself can amplify partisan divisions, specifically on contested facts. On the most crucial identity-relevant issues, think climate change, think justifications for war, think pandemic responses, agreement on basic facts is often hardest to find precisely among the most educated and politically engaged segments of the population.
So, for those of you listening who are involved in strategic communications, maybe in policymaking, military information operations, or even just trying to explain complex topics in any field, these findings really converge on three major implications for practice. First, you absolutely must design messaging for heterogeneity. You have to realize that low-involvement audiences need clear, simple, credible cues, while high-involvement audiences might need more complex arguments and linkages that resonate with their existing, often extensive, knowledge structures.
Okay, tailor the message. Second implication.
Second, you have to consciously engineer credibility. You simply cannot assume that facts will speak for themselves in a contested environment. You must strategically use identity-congruent messengers, trusted voices from within the target community, and rely on verifiable signals, including costly signals if necessary, to overcome the inherent partisan skepticism and motivated reasoning that you know you'll encounter.
Engineer credibility. And the third implication.
And finally, you must learn to anticipate misperceptions as a constant, almost baseline operational variable. Stop relying on the naive strategy of just dumping more data or more education on people and expecting it to fix the problem. You have to realize, based on Joslyn and Haider-Markel's work, that simply providing more data or promoting higher general education levels might actually polarize your most engaged audiences even further if the facts are identity relevant and contested. Instead, you need to focus much more on strategies like providing compelling alternate causal narratives, not just fact-checking denials.
Which brings us inevitably to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up. The public's capacity, as we've hopefully established across all these different works, isn't some fixed inherent quality. It is profoundly constructed by information structures, by institutional incentives, and by the power of our identities. So if the biggest disagreements on the most crucial policy issues now occur precisely among the most educated and politically engaged citizens, the very people who disproportionately run this system, we have to ask a really fundamental question. What must be fundamentally redesigned?
Exactly. Is the primary leverage point redesigning our political institutions to somehow make partisan affiliation less central to identity, less all-encompassing, less threatening when challenged? Or should we focus on fundamentally trying to change our information environment, maybe finding ways to suppress or mitigate the effects of motivated reasoning at scale? Or perhaps, should we look critically at our educational goals themselves? Should education focus not just on promoting raw cognitive ability and argumentation skills, but more deliberately on fostering intellectual humility, cognitive empathy, and perhaps a shared appreciation for objective reality, even when that reality is politically or personally inconvenient? The core paradox remains. High capacity without a foundation of shared reality might just be the engine of democratic dysfunction and gridlock. And figuring out how to bridge that gap, well, that's the profound challenge that remains before us.